So my general idea that I want to work through today in this next 12 to 14 minutes or so is to present the idea of connected sociology being not only connected geographically and historically, but also to materiality of life itself. I'm going to call this vital sociology. So a connected and vital sociology of coloniality and neo-coloniality. And the justification for this really is that the material processes of colonization have intensified and speeded up even after the period of historical political decolonization. Through the expansion of global capitalism and the scaling up of commodity chains and the intensification of material throughput of capitalism. So this intensifying material throughput is continuing the physical, biotic, and social cultural destruction that we associate with the evil of colonial dispossession and extraction. Now, the latest and most highlighted aspect of this is the struggle against climate chaos, climate breakdown, and Jason Hickel's suggestion that we must consider this treatment of the atmosphere, the climate, as a colonial appropriation of atmospheric commons. And therefore, the struggle to end climate chaos and deal with climate breakdown is ultimately a struggle against colonization itself. And I want to make a link then to the potential crime of ecocide as the kind of a bookend, which I explored in the pollution lecture, which is a word that is similar to genocide and inspired by the word genocide, but meaning unlawful or wanton acts with the knowledge of severe and long-term environmental damage. So acts, knowing acts. And that these acts don't only damage the environment itself, but people. Because when people who have not only a physical connection to the environment, but also a cultural and spiritual connection to the land are forcibly dispossessed from the land and its resources, they invariably, in the words of Damien Short, experience social death, which is his definition of genocide. So the concepts of genocide and ecocide are closely related. Thus, my argument for what I will call vital sociology is a sociology that is concerned with violence in terms of the way violence affects bodies by depriving them of vital goods and creating inequalities, vital inequalities, which are inequalities of life and health. And the life and health not only of human beings and human bodies, but also bodies of the environment, bodies of land, and bodies of water, bodies of the atmosphere. But they're not just physical bodies or biotic bodies, they're also cultural bodies. So trying to bridge this gap that we continuously create between humans and the environment and between cultures and materialities. So this is a way of thinking about things which makes ecology into a sort of bridge for decolonial critique that takes the decolonial from the epistemic and the historical and the conceptual and the theoretical towards the realities of the embodied realities of bodies and land. So in which biological and non-biological entities, materials, energy, these comprise what we might think of as life itself, and the work of life, the work of labor and care, which are central to understanding capitalism, imperialism, and colonization. So at the base of this is monoculture. So going back to ecocide and this idea of not a prior knowledge of extensive and lasting damage. We have knowledge of this for a very long time, since the beginnings of global imperialism and colonization, with the colonization of Madeira and the Azores from as early as the 1420s. And that the moving of this this deforestation for plantation agriculture of sugar to Brazil from the late 16th century to the 17th century. And this is the project of what Amitav Ghosh calls terraforming, which is a project not only of changing nature, but itself a mode of warfare, distinctive warfare, in which environmental interventions and non-human entities play a part. And this is premised upon the concept of terra nullius, the laying waste, the emptying, legal emptying of lands in order that they be turned into territories that could be considered to be Europeanized productive land. And in doing so, then creating a metabolic rift, which requires and leads on to both war and a chemical fix. So metabolic rift is a chemistry concept, which was adopted by the early Marxists as well, to think about what was happening materially to the land, because what was observed was declining soil fertility. And this motivated the 19th century wars over these mountains of bird shit that you see on the slide. These are in the Pacific islands of the coast of Bolivia and Peru. And they caused wars over this, as well as the recruitment of Chinese indentured laborers. They're the tiny figures that you see on the mountain there, enormous environmental degradation, and the accumulation of what later became national debts. Now, these mountains of bird guano were being mined to remedy soil exhaustion, which was later then fixed through the nitrogen fixation process invented by Fritz Haber and the Bosch company to manufacture ammonia for the joint purposes of war explosives and industrial agriculture. So what we see is from the 1420s to the 20th century, the development of a global socio-economic system predicated upon high energy demand, massive flows of fossil fuels, and massive chemical transfers, which then lead to pollution. And a situation where only this year we see the first scientific paper admitting that the planetary boundaries for pollution have been breached, and that the reason for this is the willful and active production of ignorance and the domination of corporate interests. And it's created ignorance around the deaths and harm that result from chemicals, thinking about pesticides alone, the equivalent of the 2 atomic bombs detonated in Japan every single year, or a comparable number of deaths which are attributed to all climate change mortality, just from the known pesticide pollution. Yeah. Okay, so just to move towards wrapping up then, to talk about the colonial logic of extraction, waste, and pollution, and connect them. And what connects them is what Larry Summers, who was at that time the head of the Global Environmental Facility of the World Bank, a financing facility for environmental measures, called the economic logic of pollution. This is a logic of cheapening, as Jason Moore and Raj Patel call it. Cheapening lives, cheapening nature, cheapening energy, cheapening food. And the mechanism of cheapening is a mechanism of racial, capitalist counting and accounting. Yeah, I've referenced there a brilliant book by Caitlin Rosenthal, Accounting for Slavery. And so this is a racial, capitalist, willful discounting and ignorance of harm to racialized bodies, or as Max Liboron calls them, the institutionalization of bad relations. Bad relations are relations that allow some amount of pollution to occur and accompanying entitlement to land to assimilate that pollution using bodies of people of racialized people and of marginalized nature as disposable. And by stigmatizing the bodies and discriminating against bodies, they render disposable beings and land and enable harm to them. So this is how resources in economies, assimilative capacity for toxins and wastes, and the effects that they have on ill health and extinction are divided north and south, with flows of resources to the north and flows of waste and toxins to the south. And at the same time, this monoculture based on this idea of wasting land, terra nullius, colonization, necessitation of war and chemical fixes in order to effect a logic of maximum yield through monopoly and competition, treating the landscape, nature, and the environment as work in both the global north and south. Okay, just to finish then, on the conservation and management frontier. When we think about scientific conservation and management, we see this as the kind of like reparative or good side of managing the environment, on environmental problems. But scientific conservation is not innocent. It's a means to continue imperial resource extraction that has been continued by post-colonial states like the state of India or Brazil, where you see colonial extractivist conservation and management to maximize commercial yield. And this is what creates war and conflicts and violent conflicts with local needs and dispossession of locals. And I think it's behind what Andrea is going to discuss in her case study, so I don't need to go into that. But this raises the three questions I really want to end with, which were just in my mind about how we think about conservation. And I was racking my brains to think about a non-colonial word for conservation. I also had a question around, you know, what happens when the extractive entity is a self-determination, a self-determining nation that is exercising their resource sovereignty. And also, what about non-states? Since in today's globalized world of commodity chains, out of the 200 largest, richest, wealthiest, most powerful entities in the world, 157 are transnational corporations, and less than 50 then are states. So I just finished there, and I'm going to stop sharing. I had various thoughts in a word cloud, but I shan't.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sue. You can keep the thoughts for after if no one asks a question and I'm awkwardly waiting, I'll just come back to you. So thanks a lot. Max, over to you now.
Thanks so much. Thank you all for being here, and thanks to the hosts for inviting me, and thanks to my fellow panelists for such stimulating and important work. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the presentation that I gave as part of this curriculum, which was based on this book, which I recently published, Palm Oil, The Grease of Empire. It's a short one. This book was in some ways, I'll tell you a little bit about its story and then what's in it. I mean, this book for me came out of the challenges of teaching. I'm not someone who's necessarily in this field looking at environments and ecology and similar themes. I'm a cultural critic by training, and also a theorist of finance and financialization. But this project came to me as part of my teaching work. I got a job teaching the nature of racial capitalism at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, which is a well-known art school in Canada. I'm quite renowned for conceptual art and for also encouraging students to think broadly and in worldly ways about the processes of art making. And I was tasked with teaching material culture there. So the stuff of the world, where it comes from, how it's made, and how it interfaces with society. And I began to look for one commodity that circulates around us all the time, that's part of our everyday life, that might at first seem invisible, or one that we didn't know existed within our life world, but that we could use to begin to tease open all of the many complexities and entanglements, and indeed the horrors of racial capitalism. And eventually I came across palm oil as that commodity. And I came to it through a somewhat inadvertent route. I began by trying to explain to students how an object can change its sociological and cultural meaning when it's decontextualized. And I began to work with the example of the famous Benin Bronzes, so-called, which some of you might have seen in the British Museum and in other Western collections. These were artifacts that were seized from the Edo Kingdom in what is now Nigeria in the 1890s, the late 1890s, as part of a British punitive expedition. Within the Edo Kingdom, in which they originated, these phenomenal works of brass, ivory, and other materials had ceremonial purposes, cultural purposes, ritualistic purposes. They represented, many of them represented archives of the sort of the national library, so to speak, but in more graphic and plastic form. But when they were seized by the British, and entered into Western collections, they came to be taken as evidence for the inherent superiority, allegedly, of British civilization and European civilization when they were put on display. And also evidence for the kind of progressivist narratives of human development that were very much in the vogue in the late 19th century and its particular iterations of theories of race, and that, of course, continue to haunt us still today. Not only haunt us discursively and intellectually in the sense that we inherit the thought world created by those colonial forebearers, but also haunt us quite literally in the sense that many, if not most, of these artifacts have never been repatriated to their places of origin and are still very much missed by the ancestors and descendants of those from whom they were stolen. It turns out, though, that the reason that the British invaded the Edo Kingdom in what is now Nigeria in 1897 was not actually to steal these phenomenal works of art. It was, in fact, to secure the British Empire's access to palm oil. Now, you might be familiar with palm oil from the many campaigns that have been waged by environmental non-governmental organizations. Practically every non-governmental organization we could name has run a campaign on palm oil, from Greenpeace to Amnesty International to Rainforest Action Network and beyond, because the labor and environmental conditions under which palm oil is produced are so horrifying. Those conditions, very briefly, because you can find out a lot about it online, include the seizure of land and the burning down of forests to make way for plantations. It includes the constant and iterative exploitation of different waves of migrant workers. It involves the poisoning of the land with pesticides, herbicides, and other additives. It includes the use of both formal state violence and informal mafia-style violence in order to enforce exploitative conditions. Those are, of course, accompanied, as they always are, by sexualized violence and misogynistic and patriarchal violence. Beyond that, there's the incredible cost to the global ecosystem in terms of loss of biodiversity as the forest is cut down to make way for plantations, as well as huge amounts of carbon that are released into the atmosphere when, very precious forest that sequesters a great deal of carbon is burned to make way for plantations, even if those plantations will eventually have palm or oil palms on them, which, as the industry likes to claim, do indeed sequester a little bit of carbon, but nowhere near as much as the biodiverse forest would have beforehand. These are only some of the litany of horrors we could go into. However, in my book, I try and point out that somehow, like, listing these horrors and also the campaigns that seek to make the Western consumer, the wealthy consumer, aware of these so that the consumer can make better consumer choices and can perhaps participate in boycotts and other consumer-based activism, if you can call it activism, I think is very dangerous for a number of reasons. First and foremost, perhaps because the palm oil industry has proven itself extremely adept in recent years at co-opting the very language of its critics and suggesting that it is in fact they who are moving towards horizons of sustainability, that they are feeding the world's poor by producing a cheap, readily accessible form of oil, that in fact they have made great advances in reducing emissions in their industry, and on and on and on. And somehow many of the ideas and discourses that have been proposed by opponents of the industry have found their way into the discourses of the industry itself, essentially allowing the industry to capture many of the sympathies that NGOs have been trying to capture as well. And that has been done, of course, as you would likely imagine, through the commissioning of very powerful public relations and advertising firms, the likes of which you might be familiar with from campaigns to sell cigarettes or to sell petrochemicals and fossil fuels as well. The second problem, however, with the way that most large environmental NGOs, and the vast majority of them are headquartered in the global north or the so-called west, is that they tend to assume, often for tactical reasons, that the only meaningful horizon for our political participation is as consumers. And they tend to hail their target markets, if we can use those terms, the people to whom they wish to speak, in terms of you as a consumer should take these actions based on your sort of a kind of moral position relative to the horrors that are being unleashed on the world by the palm oil industry. There's very successful campaigns, for instance, that have mobilized what have been called charismatic megafauna, including orangutans, notably, but also rhinos, tigers, and other species that gain a lot of human sympathy because they're very dramatic, that then suggests that the proper disposition towards habitat loss and the horrors of the palm oil industry is to make different kinds of consumer choices. And indeed, there are many different consumer choices to be made. Palm oil is found in an estimated 50% of supermarket products. That not only includes, processed foods, like, for instance, ramen noodles is one of the ones that I speak about in my book quite a bit, processed baked goods, cookies, crackers, biscuits. It also finds its way into dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of different foods as emulsifiers, coagulants, preservatives, etc. It's also a main ingredient in many of the detergents and soaps that we use. Also a carrier for medicines. It can also be found in a vast variety of industrial products as well, both as a lubricant and also as an additive. So essentially, palm oil, even though we might not think about it very often, and it's sourced exclusively from countries in the tropics, is in fact all around us. It's part of the world that we collectively inhabit. And in fact, and here I'm echoing Simran Gill and Michael Tossig's work on this subject, we are all becoming palm. We are all becoming into a relationship with the oil palm, this strange tree, or I should say plant, that was first cultivated for millennia in West Africa, and then, as through the process of colonialism and imperialism, brought into the world system that that capitalism created. That process of bringing palm oil into a global system was one, as you might imagine, of incredible violence and incredible cheapening, to use again that terminology from Raj Patel and Jason Moore. It is a process where a commodity, palm oil, becomes cheap through the cheapening of the lives, the labor, the care, the fuel, the money, and the land on which humans depend. And this incredible outsourcing of violence from the global north, who tend to be the largest consumers, or at least were the global's largest consumers of palm oil, to racialized people in the global south, as we've already heard. I would also like to echo the discourse of metabolism, although in my book I use it in a way that's informed by the notion of the metabolic rift, but also I'm trying to think about it quite literally, which is, what do we make of a world where millions of people, perhaps 1 billion people, metabolize palm oil every day in order to get enough energy to lend their shoulder to the wheel of capitalist production? And what does it mean to think about the oil palm, the plant species, as a metabolic engine for sunlight? That is in some ways taking solar radiation and transforming it into these fleshy, oily bundles, which are then converted through industrial mechanisms into this sort of bleached, deodorized oil, which then is shipped around the world to find its way into finished commodities, as well as into cooking oil. And this brings me to the other side of that metabolic question, which is that for millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world, the reason why palm oil has become popular is because it's been so artificially cheapened, and because the processes of capitalist dispossession have meant that artisanal, local, communal forms of oil making for edible oil have been displaced or destroyed. And instead, we have huge swaths of the global population who are dependent on earning capitalist wages in order to afford to purchase oil, edible oil, which is an important part of human nutrition, as well as other nutritional commodities, simply for their own survival. For this reason, I dwell with palm oil as what I think about as the food of the world's poor, the fat of the world's poor in a sense. And here I'm also interested in us dwelling a little more with the notion of fat and abundance. And I draw a parallel between, on the one hand, the way that typically what I would simply call them white supremacist governments, but you might want to call them governments in the global north or whatever, have this perennial concern about overpopulation and there being too much flesh of the other. And at the same time, the concerns that are also emanate from often the same people or the same ideological vectors about body fats, especially as they're emblematized in the completely bogus pseudoscience measurement of body mass index. And in both cases, the notion of fat can tie together the way that, I don't know a better academic term than concern trolling occurs around a quote unquote overpopulation and around, fat politics, that in some way, once again, return power to the hands of social elites. These are just some of the things that I try and work through in the book as a way of thinking through the complexities of palm oil and what it means for us today. And I end the book by asking us to recognize that palm oil in some way superintends or can be seen as one particularly grim example of a world of human sacrifice, where millions of people and whole ecosystems are put on the altar of capitalist accumulation. And that, for me, begs the question then of what cosmology we would need in order to think through a different kind of system, that it might not just be a matter, as the NGOs tell us, of buying different things or having different policies. We would also need to fundamentally question the way that we understand the world fits together and the chains of causality therein. I'll leave it there.
Cool, thank you very much, Max. So last but not least, Andrea, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this panel, and also thank you for the amazing presentations by Sue and Max. So what I'm going to do right now is offer a brief summary of what I did in the longer video of the Connected Sociologies curriculum, where I talked about extractivism and I explained, in broader terms, how this term has been conceptualized, especially in Latin America, and how that conceptualization offers us a situated perspective of how extractivism works. So I'm gonna do a shorter version, and I'm also gonna land in a national strike that it's happening right now in Ecuador, where one of the demands there's a set of 10 demands that social movements are demanding from the state, and these social movements are led by the indigenous movement of Ecuador, one of the strongest and best organized movements in the region. But one of those demands is to declare a moratorium for oil and mining projects. So there are also communities mobilized against the expansion of oil and mining projects in Ecuador. So in order to understand how extractivism has been broadened and critically conceptualized by social scientists working in or on and from Latin America in the last years, it's also important to center on the important role that social movements have played in shaping these approaches to extractivism, and also in offering alternatives towards post-extractive societies. The reason for this region of focus in Latin America is precisely that, is because in Latin America, social movements in the last decades have played a huge role in complexifying this term. That is a term that not only refers to how extractivism works as a mode of extracting resources from the soil, right? But is linked to other modes of accumulation, regimes of power, colonial history, and there have been a lot of social scientists being in dialogue with these movements, but there has also been a dialogue that has contributed to this broader understanding of extractivism. Of course, this regional focus on Latin America does not mean that this concept is not useful or does not apply to other regions like Africa, Asia, North America, and even Europe. However, the study of extractivism has been in Latin America, or my focus will allow me to show in concrete ways how extractivism shapes post-colonial societies. So since the 2000s, there has been a lot of intellectual production on extractivism that has, as I said, complexified this descriptive definition that defines extractivism as activities that remove great quantities of natural resources that are then not processed or are done so in a limited fashion and that leave a country as exports. So the 2000s is a very important period because those are the years of very high prices of commodities like oil, copper, and soy due to the growing international demand for these raw materials. And that created a lot of pressure on territories that weren't confronted with extractive activities before, or where extractive activities started before, but not in such a massive scale. So since the 2000s, there have been a huge production of research on extractivism, and this work has connected this term and broadened this term and connected it with theories of development and colonialism, with theories on forms of capitalist accumulation and resistance, and also with theories related to the financial economy and other ways of extracting value. So the word extractivism has also been used in studies in order to show how this action of extracting is not only related to the soil or to certain commodities, but also to the ways in which capitalism can also extract value from labor, from also intellectual labor, from humans and ideas, and different ways in which financial capitalism commodifies other aspects of life. For a matter of time, I will mostly focus on two of these approaches now. So the first approach that conceptualizes extractivism is one that conceptualizes it as a mode of accumulation that varies or changes according to different phases of capitalism. So scholars like Eduardo Budinas, Alberto Acosta, Maristela Svampa, among many others, differentiate different types of extractivism according to the different modes of accumulation that have characterized them. Even though Latin American history has been marked by extraction of natural resources since colonial times, extractivism has mutated along with capitalism's different phases. So these scholars argue that it is not possible to conceptualize contemporary extractivism without understanding how former colonies, which then became independent nation states, have been relegated to the role of peripheral economies and exporters of raw materials to nourish the demands from the centers of political and economic power like Europe and the United States. At the same time, these scholars argue that with each phase of capitalism, resource extraction has changed and translated into new modes of accumulation, like moving from colonial plunder to independence era enclave economies, and also that the global demand for natural resources has taken new shapes. Nowadays, we have new powers like China driving the demand for raw materials, right? And when we're talking about mode of accumulations, we're talking about the ways in which resources are owned, administrated, and invested. So are resources administrated by the state, or is the state delegated that function to transnational corporations? Is the money coming from extractive projects going to be invested in education, in health, in those countries where those resources are extracted, or is it going to be used for private profit or to pay foreign debt? So these scholars argue that during the 80s and 90s, the dominant form of extractivism in Latin America was neoliberal extractivism, which was characterized by the limited role of the state in extractive projects and the transfer of extractive licenses to participants in the open market, by the expansion of extractive projects, also as a means to access international loans or to pay foreign debt. So if you look, for example, at agreements between Latin American states and the International Monetary Fund, you can find, ways in which extractivism and extractive activities are included into those agreements. Extractivism during this period is also characterized, according to the scholars, by the pastoral role of extractive companies in the communities where certain resources were extracted. These commodities compensated for the state absence in terms of social services and infrastructure projects. So they would build, like a soccer playground, or like a playground, or maybe invest money for to build a school. And in that way, they also created a relationship of dependency, right, with the communities. Starting in the 2000s, according to these scholars, we see the implementation of a different type of extractivism with a new form of accumulation in Latin America. The reasons for this emergence, as I said before, are the high prices of commodities like oil, copper, and soy, and others. And on the other hand, the electoral success of leftist and progressive parties in countries like Argentina, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, among others. Many of these governments came to power by promising that they would dismantle neoliberalism and neoliberal ways of administrating resources. And this is what scholars called Neo-Extractivism. So Neo-Extractivism was characterized by the massive territorial expansion of the extractive frontier to areas previously considered non-productive, and this includes territories inhabited by indigenous and peasant communities. In Ecuador, for example, the place where I've done most of my research and political work, there was a massive expansion of oil into the center-south Amazon, because oil extraction has concentrated mostly in the north, but since the 2000s, it expanded to the center-south. And also new extractive industries were opened, like mega mining projects. Neo-extractivism is also characterized by the increasing role of the state in extractive projects. So the increasing role of state-owned extractive companies, but also bigger taxation of extractive companies by the state. And finally, Neo-extractivism is characterized by the state's investment of extractive revenues in public sectors like health, education, infrastructure projects like highways, developmental programs aimed to reduce poverty and inequality, and monetary compensations for local communities affected by extractive projects. In the case of Ecuador, one of those monetary compensations, or one of these projects to kind of respond to the community's demands, was to build cities and educational centers called the Educational Centers of the Millennium in the Amazon, as a way to compensate, for this abandonment of these communities there, which is, I'm very critical towards that discourse, but it was different from, the neoliberal period. So while these approaches acknowledge that these were improvements during the neo-extractive period, in terms of the reduction of poverty and how these governments use the money from extractivism to invest in social welfare programs, they also argue that neo-extractivism not only continue Latin America's peripheral role as exporter of primary commodities, but also intensify the region's dependency in the global energy market by expanding extractive activities in territories where they did not exist before. They also argued that the negative socio-ecological impacts of extractive activities continued and intensified given the immense scale of extractive projects like mega mining projects. And this is in the case of mega mining, and that's why we call it mega mining. Since the 2000s, we also have the implementation of new technologies that allow companies to make territories that were not profitable and to pretty much disappear a river or disappear a mountain in order to extract copper, gold, silver. Lastly, these scholars argue that colonial and capitalist dynamics of territorial occupation and dispossession have also continued and intensified during neo-extractivism, and that it is no coincidence that since the neo-extractive period, there has been an explosion of conflicts over natural resource extraction in the region. So despite the fact that progressive governments enjoyed popular support and invested in developmental projects to pacify anti-extractive resistance, many communities mobilized against extractive projects and also against the kind of development that they were offered by the state, which did not consult them or did not respect their relationship to their territories and their forms of living. So the second approach I would like to cover today, and I will do it very shortly because I know I'm running out of time, conceptualizes extractivism as a discourse shaped by social movements. And here I'm inspiring, or like I follow the work of Fia Riofrancos, who is a political scientist who has analyzed the role that social movements have played in shaping debates about extractivism. So while scholars from neo-extractivism have done important work to show from a macroanalytical perspective the negative impacts of extractivism, they often explain the multiplication of anti-extractive movements as a response or as a reaction to the expansion of extractivism. In contrast, the second way of defining extractivism centers on the collective agency and the intellectual production of grassroots activists who, through their forms of critique and mobilization, shape the lines of political confrontation around extractivism and influence intellectual elaborations on this term. So for example, in Ecuador, the indigenous movement, as I said, one of the most important and best organized social movements in the region, has played a huge role in contributing to an understanding of extractivism beyond a descriptive definition that only focuses on explaining the negative impacts of extractivism on local communities. Since the founding of the indigenous organization CONAIE in 1986, the indigenous movement has combined direct action strategies to halt the expansion of oil projects and later on mining projects with public declarations and proposals that underscore the colonial and capitalist dimensions of neoliberal extractivism, but also neo-extractivism. At the same time, this movement has contributed with alternative proposals for post-extractive futures like summa causa, which is a Quechua term that means good living in English, and proposes new forms of relation between human beings and nature and among human beings. And this is a concept that was actually adopted in the 2008 Constitution of Ecuador after years of political mobilization by CONAIE against neoliberal governments. And as I said, actually right now, there's a massive national strike taking place in Ecuador, which is led by this indigenous movement and is demanding an end to neoliberal austerity policies, which, because we have a neoliberal government in power again, presided by a former banker, Guillermo Lasso. But they also demanding this more like the halt of extractive expansion. So the indigenous movement prepared a list of 10 demands, and one of them includes the demand to declare oil and mining moratorium. And what is important about this demand is that it thinks extractivism also in terms of social justice, because they are also demanding the reinstatement of oil subsidies. So one of the demands is like the reinstatement of oil subsidies, and the other one is to stop extractivism. And many liberal and bourgeois environmental organizations have said that this is a contradictory, or like this is a contradiction in the agenda of the indigenous movement. But the indigenous movement has responded with like, first, we are like a country where like people, especially peasant communities, depend on subsidies in order to do their work, especially to transport the food. And those were removed in 2019. And we need them back because we cannot forget that we need also to combine environmental demands with social justice demands, especially in a context like Ecuador. So I'm more than happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, and also to talk more about my research with Amazonian indigenous women who have also made visible the patriarchal dimensions of extractivism. But I'm going to leave it there because I know I think I exceeded my time. So I'm more than happy to talk about that in the Q&A.